hello and welcome to this video, which is about sewing the mock-ups for my red-threaded 1860s corset. I started with the pattern as it comes and then made tweaks and adjustments until it fitted me as I wanted it to. So let's get started. I used a denim fabric, which I pressed and folded so that there were 2 layers on the cutting board. I had already cut out and prepared the paper pattern pieces. I laid out the pieces needed for the mock-up and aligned the grain lines as required. I fine-tuned the placement by measuring the distance from the grain lines to the edge of the fabric and pinning to secure. Then I cut out the pieces with a rotary cutter. I transferred the markings. I pressed the centre fronts and centre backs, folding the facings underneath. And then I cut and ironed back the openings for the bust gauze or gussets on the front pieces. I'm not going to show very much construction in this video, as this is about fitting, and I'll deal with the construction in the video about making the final garment. But I do want to show the bust gauze, as it's something a little different. After securing at the bottom, I then pinned up either side, keeping to the 10mm seam allowance. I then top stitched using a 2.5mm stitch length to allow easy removal if required. Then I pinned on the second gore and stitched it as well. Then on the other front piece, I inserted the third gore, and the fourth gore. You can see how much volume the gores add. And it was slightly confusing, so just note that we want the bust gauze to have the front edge towards the apex of the bust. Then I attached the side seams and pressed them flat, and attached the hip gauze, and then the back lacing panels. As this was a mock-up or toile, and I expected to have to make several iterations, I didn't want to sew in a busk each time. Instead, I made busk strips, and I'll link to the video on making them above and in the description. I used 1 line of stitching, no back stitching, and a 2.5mm stitch length. And I also applied a pair of lacing strips. From here, I added the lacing. Then it was time to tape in the bones. For this mock-up, I tried spiral steel on one side and synthetic whalebone on the other. I used my nails to really press the masking tape down and into the corners to keep them secure for the fitting. The bones don't have to be the perfect length, but unlike I have here, it's better if any overhang happens down over your hips rather than up into your underarm. So here's the first mock-up. I'm really happy with it, but we do need to make a few changes to get it to fit a bit better. Going to increase the bust gauze to increase the size of the bust. Make it a bit higher either from the waist, bringing up the start of those gauze, or possibly to the top. And I want to try both just to sort of see how that goes. I'm going to increase the hips as well because they're feeling quite tight at the moment. The bone channel on the hips is also a bit weird. I'm not sure what I've done there, but we can make it work. And we need to adjust the hip size first anyway. And then after that, I might also add some to the back panels as there's quite a lacing gap at the moment, but I want to make the other changes first to see where that gets me. I removed the bones from the synthetic whalebone half, then unpicked the lacing and busk strips. I straightened the waist, then used a large metal ruler and my rotary cutter to cut parallel to the waist. I spread the pieces out by 1 inch and cut off a piece to add in. I pinned that to the lower half, stitched it down, and then repeated to the upper half. I cut down the middle of each bust gore, and I put a few slashes into the hip gore as well. I cut off more fabric and divided it into gore shapes. I stitched down each piece to one side of the slashes, so that on the body I will be able to rotate and pin it to where it needs to sit. I reapplied the busk and lacing strips and the bones and was ready for the second fitting. So this is the side. I've lengthened the waist, I've slashed the bust and hip gauze, and we'll adjust them now. This side is as per the original currently. And I think already I'm liking the feel of having the longer waist. So I think that's the way I want to go, rather than just increasing the bust. But we'll see. Might start with the bust. So I've pinned them there where it's sitting comfortably. But what I'm trying to do is keep this side bone a bit like the side of a bra. So keeping all the breast flesh in front of it is sort of the aim. Might need to sit back very slightly on the real one. But that's the idea. Have that in there and then need to support. So I might pull this in just a little bit more, so it's more of a shape than a V shape. Okay, so I think as a preliminary adjustment for the bust, that sort of, yeah, I'll let this out so this can sit a bit more comfortably. But first, let's have a preliminary look at the hip. So what I noticed when I put it on is really all that space is back here. So that probably explains why the bone channels were going a little bit kooky. So I've pinned the front 3, and there's a little bit of a triangle added into the very front just to get a little bit more room in there. The second one is pretty much as it is. I don't think that's a place we do need additional room. Tiny bit to the third one. Most is the fourth, and I can't reach to pin back there, so I'm just going to mark it on. So that's not an aesthetic process, but just marking where that is, and then it's iterative. So it's okay that that doesn't seem perfectly precise. We'll see how it goes. So I'm going to slash the gauze now that we've seen what it's like over here, and I'll slash the hips, but I'm going to put more slashes in the back on this side. It's my plan. Here we are. I slashed the bust and hip gauze and had a bit of a play with this side, but I've decided I like the waist extension and the way that this bust gore development's going. So I'm going to go with this side for bust and waist. So now we've just got to investigate the hip a little bit more. I've pinned them on so that they sit smoothish. I think there's a little bit too much room in there now, so I just need to tweak it slightly. So I've now adjusted. It's a bit rough, but I think it's given me an idea of where I need to go for the next iteration. So this is as far as I think I can alter with this mock-up. The plan is to alter the pattern now, altering the bust gores based on this side, the waist based over here, and the hip gore from over here. And I'll also add about 1/2 inch to either side of the back.
I removed the busk and lacing strips to enable a clear view of the changes required. My first step was to add in that inch at the waist, perpendicular to the grain lines. For the bust gores, I marked the amount of fabric that I had added in. Then I cautered my pattern piece and manipulated it to mimic an average of those amounts. I stuck it to a piece of paper and cut out my new pattern piece. It was the same process for the hip gore. Then I repeated the construction process as before. I taped the bones in securely, and it was ready for the third fitting.
So here we have toile 2. So I'm now happy with the length of the waist at the front, and I really think I'm happy with the hip gore as well. A downside of having lengthened the waist is that now at the side under the arm it's just a little bit high, so I want to drop that by about 1 centimetre. As far as the bust gores go, we've definitely made progress, but I think there's still a little bit of tweaking required. The shape isn't quite right, and I'm getting a lot of ripples at the side. So the next step is to make some minor tweaks to this toile, bring it slightly down under the sides and fiddling with those bust gores. I think I'm going to bring them back to being a bit more smooth after all. Not completely triangular, but just a little bit more tapered in their shape.
I started with a traced version of bust gore number 2 and used a French curve to smooth and lengthen. Then I added seam allowance. Here we can see the difference between pattern pieces number 2 and number 3. Then I lowered it at the side, under the arm.
So this is number 3, and it's sitting very smoothly. I'm happy with it overall. Compare it back to number 2 where it's got this sort of slight weirdness going on and the creases in the pattern. This side is not completely creaseless, but it's sitting a lot more smoothly. Now, and I guess also under the arm, it's sitting a lot more comfortably. Just dropping it by that little bit was enough, although I do need to stitch those stitches at the side seam again. But yes, happy with just that little bit of a drop, and then I think I'm happy with how it comes up at the front and the back. I just need to raise this part of the main front pattern piece to match that extra centimetre, and then that'll be comfortable. Just a little bit gapy at the top is one thing, so I'm thinking and if I just get it over by 1/2 centimetre, getting a little bit ruffled, so I'm not sure that pinning is going to tell me all I need to know at this fine-tuning time. I might try that, just very slightly bringing it in. One final thing. Now that we're getting down to real fine-tuning, the side stream isn't sitting completely vertically because we've added room into the bust, and as is often the case for me, this is not the angle to see it, but at that top area there, that often gets tight on me. So I'm thinking I might add a little bit of room into there. So the adjustments made there was to this side of the front bust gore. So I think we're at a point where, yes, I want to differentiate the front and side bust gores. So I think it's sitting better at the top, but it is, if we see pulling slightly in there, you compare it to that side, it isn't. So I need to just smooth that line out a bit. So that'll be the next step. So I think I'm happy with the side bust gore because that's sitting a lot smoother, relatively smooth, whereas that is significantly more crinkly. But just still tweaking this front bust gore. Okay, the other change was that I added in a little bit to the side back panel on this side. So you can see there's a little addition. So we did this because the side seam was angling back. So, and I often need to add a little bit of room to the top of my corsets, just for the shaping. So I added a little bit, and it's sitting better now. Not perfect, but better.
I also want to take out a little wedge out of the side back panel above the waist and move the bone that's sitting similarly to a bra underwire at the side a little bit further back. I unpinned the back seam to be able to put in the dart to check the fit of taking the wedge out of the pattern. Then I reattached the back. And here is bust gore 3A, which has been taken in just slightly along the side edge closest to the busk. And that line was smoothed with a French curve. I added a bone at the side and moved across the bone next to the bust and added a second one there.
So, things that have changed. I've put in the new bust gore at the front, so leaving the side one the same, but updating the front one. And I think I'm happy with that now. It seems to be sitting calmly. It'll need a slight trim at the very end, but that's okay. As far as pattern pieces go, I'm happy with that. Other thing I did was tack in there. So if we see on the other side, it gets creased there. So I'm very happy with my adjustments to the back panel. And then the other thing I did was readjust the bones on this side. I moved this bone back and it's a lot more comfortable. Okay, so I think actually shape of corset is good.
I traced out the pattern pieces and incorporated some adjustments, with more to follow now. The side back piece, which had been increased at the waist, has now been tapered as per the dart, and spread vertically to give more space in the upper back. I decided to leave the exact bone placement on the hip gore until I make the final garment, as it was a bit tricky. Let's look at the front facing piece. I wanted a wider one than came with the pattern, so I traced it off my front piece. I increased the height of the front at the bust gores and used a French curve to smooth the lines. and then updated the front facing. I evened up and lowered the side seam. And with that, my fitted corset pattern was finished.
And that's the process. I've now fitted my red-threaded 1860s corset and adjusted the pattern, ready to go. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll join me again next time. Goodbye. Hello, I'm Catherine from Crystal Pegasus Costumes, and welcome to this video, which is all about how I made this corset. I used Redthreaded's 1860s Gored corset pattern, and I have a separate video about my mock-up process where I adapted the pattern to fit me. And so without further ado, let's get sewing.
Here are all the pattern pieces as I got to in the fitting video. When I take away the gore pieces, the ones left will be silk fused to coutil. The gore pieces will all be quilted, which we'll look at soon. First, let's prepare the fused pieces. 3 layers were used. Firstly, a white small weave herringbone coutil, a red silk satin, which I was fortunate enough to buy most of a bolt as a remnant, and Bondaweb, a double-sided iron-on fusible interfacing to join the 2 fabrics together. I laid out the silk, wrong side up, then the Bondaweb. I trimmed down the silk, leaving overhang at all edges, and pinned the layers together. I used the iron to fuse the 2 layers together, working outwards from the centre and doing a small part at a time. It was a slow process, but the outcome is worth it. I peeled off the Bondaweb backing paper. Then I laid out the coutil, laid over the silk, right side up this time, so the fusible layer is towards the coutil. Then I smoothed and pinned as before. Back to the ironing board, where I fused the silk to the coutil. Then I was ready to cut out my pieces. I laid out the pattern pieces, aligning the grain and pinning at both ends of the grain line. Then weighing down. I cut out the pieces with my rotary cutter, using a ruler for the straight edges and freehanding the curved edges. I repeated the process for the rest of the pieces. I transferred the gore and bone channel markings onto the inside of the pieces, and the fused pieces were prepared. For the hip and bust gauze, I created a quilted textile using coutil, 2 layers of bamboo cotton batting, cotton sateen, and silk. I smoothed and weighed down the layers, then pinned around the edges. Firstly, I stitched along the top edge using a walking foot to secure the layers together. I laid my ruler at the desired angle for my quilting, and I tacked on a guideline for me to follow for my stitching. I kept the fabric as flat as I could and stitched along next to the guideline. Then I stitched another line 2 centimeters over and parallel to the first, and repeated for each line. Once I had done from the middle to the right, I did the same the other way and moved from the middle 2 centimeters to the left each time. There was a decided difference between the 2 halves, so I decided to work from one corner over for the second direction of stitching as much as I could, and tacked down my next guideline. Then I stitched the second direction of the quilting, and my quilted textile was complete. Walking foot for the win. I pinned down my pieces, aligned the grain, and traced around them. I stitched just inside the lines I had drawn, we can see it from the front and from the back. Then I cut out the quilted pieces along the drawn lines. To be able to bind the edges, I cut bias strips of silk. My next step was to bind the edges of the gauze and facing pieces which will be visible on the inside of the finished corset. For the gauze, I sewed the binding to the wrong side, as that's where the edge will be visible. The silk had a tendency to fray, so I decided to overlock the quilted edges that were not bound or not going to be sewn. I ironed the back lacing panels in half and stitched along the bust gore line on the front panels. And with that, all the pieces were prepared and I was ready to start assembly. It was time to insert the busk, and I started pin's side first. I stitched the facing to the front piece along the centre front line as marked on the facing piece. I pressed the seam allowance towards the facing piece and then top stitched. I pressed the front piece so that the centre front lines matched up and the placket was created. Then I stitched in the ditch along the centre front line. Time to bring in the busk. Taking the pin side, I marked the top and bottom of the busk and the location of each pin. I used an awl to create the holes which I inserted the pins through. Pausing on the pins, it was time to start the loop side. I pinned the front to the facing, aligning the centre front line. I marked the top and bottom of the busk, and then the location of each loop. I stitched along the centre front line, raising the needle and skipping over the areas where the loops need to pass out. I pressed the seam open, then top stitched along the facing side, and pressed the seam closed. I inserted the loops, and tested that it could attach smoothly to the pins, which it could. I used a bone to pull the loops through while I stitched the busk in. Using a zipper foot, I stitched right next to the busk on both the front pieces. Hurrah! The busk was inserted. It was time to insert the bust gauze. First, I cut down the centre of the gore opening. Then I warmed it up with the iron and pressed it open along the sewn fold lines with my fingers. I pinned the bust gore into place, starting at the very bottom to set that position first. Then pinning up each side, easing it around and ensuring that the edge sits 10 millimeters from the edge of the gore. Next, I pinned the second side. I top stitched the gore into place. I trimmed down the folded in couture. Then I stitched a second line around the gore, securing the raw edges underneath. I repeated this process for the second gore and the other half of the corset. It was time to add those bone channels which do not go over the hip gore, starting with the side back pieces. I stuck pins through to mark the line of the bone channel onto the right side of the fabric. Then on the wrong side, I laid a 20mm wide herringbone tape along the line and used masking tape to hold it in position. I stitched down the centre of the bone channel along the pinned line, as this was a double boning channel. I removed the masking tape, then I stitched 8mm either side of the centre line, and the double bone channel was sewn. Then the bone channels on the front pieces were done in the same way. The line was pinned through to the front, and the herringbone tape was held in place with masking tape. I stitched down the middle of the double bone channel, then removed the masking tape. I switched to the zipper foot, folded the bust gore out of the way, and stitched 8mm from the middle on either side. Then the same process was repeated for the other bone channels on the front pieces, which were all the bone channels I needed to sew at that point. I pinned the front to the side, then stitched, pressed the seam towards the front, and top stitched to secure. I trimmed down the top layer of the seam allowance, and I was ready to attach the hip gores. I pinned the hip gore to the main piece of the corset, starting at the balance marks and moving my way out. I stitched the two pieces together, then stitched on a piece of bias binding because I wanted to minimise the bulk of the quilting and finish the edge. I trimmed down the seam allowance of the quilted hip gore and clipped the fused couture layer. I folded over the bias binding and pinned that down. I top stitched with a white upper thread, red lower thread. Then I did a second line of stitching and even a third to really hold that seam allowance down. It's not perfect, but I was happy to try new things. Time to finish the assembly. I stitched a bone channel parallel to the busk, top stitching through the two layers. I top stitched along the centre back edge of the back panel, then I pinned the back to the rest of the corset and stitched with a 15mm seam allowance. I pressed the seam towards the back and top stitched, then trimmed down the seam allowance. Next came the bone and grommet channels at the back. I stitched in the ditch along the seam on the back panel and then 12mm in, creating another bone channel. At this point, all the pieces were assembled, which is an exciting part of any project. It was time to insert the flat steel bones either side of the grommets and next to the busk. Then the synthetic whalebones into the bone channels I had so far. I had shaped the ends to match the bone channels where needed. Grommets next. I marked the grommet locations and cut holes with my prim pliers. I inserted the grommets in my normal manner, using the prim pliers, 2-part grommets, widening the hole with an awl, pushing the first part through, Second part goes on next, and then give it a big squeeze with the prim pliers. And a grommet is done. Here we can see the back and the front. And then I added in the laces. Almost ready for my first fitting of the corset. The final step in preparation was to tape in the remaining bones, leaving them free over the hips.
So here we are, the first try-on. The purpose of this is to pinpoint the location for the bone channels over the hip gauze. That's why it's all quite lumpy down there. As you just saw, these are taped on, and so we need to work out where they're going. I think I'm pretty happy with the bottom of the corset. And using the line that was planned, we'll get these bone channels in, trim it off and bind the bottom. I'm less thrilled with the top, but my thought is let's get the bottom sorted first, and then we'll turn our attention up to here.
I gave the bones a wiggle to check they were sitting where they wanted to, then marked the locations with pins. I compared the two sides and evened up the placements, then marked the location of the bone channels over the hip gauze, and transferred the bone channel lines to the outside with pins in the same way I had earlier. I laid on the herringbone tape, and as these were single bone channels, not double, I could only tape one side and used a few pins to hold the other. I stitched the first side of the bone channel, keeping the edge of the foot following the pinned centre line. I removed the bones and masking tape, then I stitched the second side of the bone channel. To finish these single bone channels, I stitched again either side, creating double lines of stitching. As well as the look, this had the benefit of catching down the tape. Did the same for the rest of the side bone channels. Then inserted the bones. After a quick try-on to confirm I was happy with the progress, I was ready to bind the bottom edge. I trimmed down the bottom edge. I attached a strip of bias, right sides together, and stitching with red thread. I pressed the bias binding down. Then I folded it over and pinned it in place. I stitched in the ditch, and after a press, I had a nice neat binding on the bottom edge. It was time for the next fitting. I was very happy with the lower half of the corset and the bottom edge, and how most of the top was sitting, but I decided that the apex of the bust needed to come in just a little. I carefully unpicked the top 6 centimeters of each gore at the bust apex, and tied that off underneath, burying the threads. I moved the edges of the gauze in so that they were touching, and pinned into position. I re-stitched the gauze down, and then tied off and buried the threads. The stitching was a bit wobbly, but at least it was done. As I did when binding the bottom edge, I trimmed the top edge down, stitched on a strip of bias binding, which I folded and pinned down, and then stitched in the ditch. At this point, my corset was fully structurally assembled. After considering a few options of decorative lace, I decided on a white cotton lace with ribbon trim, and after a few trials, I settled on a yellow silk ribbon. I pinned on my lace, then stitched it down along the top and middle and bottom. The next decorative element was the flossing. I tried a few options on a flossing sampler and determined that I wanted to use De Vere Yarns size 36 silk, number 1 white, 101 blanc, 68 banana, and 90 ingot, coming together to form a little gradient. Then onto the flossing on the corset. For greater detail on flossing technique, please see my flossing videos. I created a gradient from light to dark, carefully counting stitches and spacing it out. All the ends of the threads were buried, keeping the back nice and neat. I was very happy with how the flossing came out and thought it added a certain something special. I also decorated the base of the bust gauze, which had the benefit of securing them nicely. The final piece of functional decoration was the arrow hook for holding down petticoats. With it in place, the corset was complete.
So here we are, my completed 1860s Gored corset. Overall, I'm absolutely thrilled with it. I think it came up really well. I'm pretty happy with the fit, although it's not completely perfect along the top line. There's a bit of space there, but for the moment, I think that's nothing that a roughly corset cover can't hide. I am particularly pleased with the quilting and the flossing and the lace. I think those are details that really make this corset. Plus the va-va-voom shape, of course. I do feel really comfortable and supported. The waist is sitting nicely, and then there's the support from the corset under the bust and the chemise at the top. So overall, I am very happy and excited to get on with more 1860s garments. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll join me again next time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to this video, which is all about how I made my drawers, chemise and corset cover for my 1860s undergarments. All three were sewn using a lovely light white cotton voile and decorated with cotton lace. What I particularly like about this trio of garments is that they illustrate a range of ways to get the pattern to make your clothing. The drawers were made using the truly Victorian pattern TV 106, 1865 chemise and drawers. This is a multi-size pattern, probably what most people would think of as a standard pattern for modern sewing. The pattern comes with multiple sizes in it, so you cut out your size and sew with that. I drafted the pattern for my chemise using instructions by Elizabeth Stuart Clark, and I scaled up a single size pattern for my corset cover. I used the Christine corset cover by Bella Designs. I'll put links to all of these in the description box below. So now let's look at each item in turn, starting with the drawers. On a double layer of fabric, I cut out the leg pieces. Then I cut strips of bias for binding, and I cut 2 of each waistband piece on the fold. My next task was to put in the pin tucks. I started by folding up at 15 centimeters above the bottom edge of the leg piece and pressing. I stitched 7 millimeters from the fold. I pressed the pin tuck flat, flipped it over, and folded it again, this time 16 millimeters from the seam I had just sewn, and then pressed in this new fold. I stitched the second tuck, also at 7 millimeters. After pressing flat, I did a third tuck, and a fourth. At this stage, all the pieces were cut out and prepared, ready to assemble. Then it was time to sew up the inside leg seams with the included 1/2 inch seam allowance. To keep things as simple as possible, I decided to overlock my edges. I wasn't too fussed about historical accuracy. After pressing the seams, they were starting to look a little bit like drawers. I laid my bias strip along the crotch edge of the leg and stitched down. I firstly pressed the seam towards the bias and then folded the bias strip to the inside of the crotch edge, folding the raw edge under to create a facing, and pressing down. Then I top stitched, and so I had a sturdy and secure bound crotch edge. I next added the gathering stitches along the top of the legs, although it's a little difficult to see here. Then I moved on to the waistband, joining the front and back pieces. I pressed up 1/2 inch on the inside waistband. Then I stitched the 2 waistbands together along the top and the sides and clipped the curves. After folding right side out and pressing, the waistband was all prepared. I gathered the legs and pinned them to the waistband, overlapping the 2 legs at the centre back and stroking the gathers to smooth them. I stitched along the waistband seam, being extra careful that everything was sitting correctly at the overlap of the two leg pieces at the centre back. I trimmed down the bias facing from the leg pieces, folded over the inner waistband and pinned it in place at the centre back. Then I pinned down the rest of the folded over waistband along the inside. I first top stitched and then stitched in the ditch along the waistband to ensure I had caught all the layers. At that point, the drawers were all in one piece. I switched to my Chemise DM7200 machine to sew the buttonholes. I do enjoy the automatic features on this machine, including a selection of stitches and buttonholes, as well as the automatic cutter. It can be tricky to get a good view for the camera when it's stitching a buttonhole, but I'm generally very happy with the results. With the drawers inside out, I folded up the hem to be 2 centimeters from the bottom of the pin tuck, pressed, folded in the edge, and pressed it again. I top stitched the hem, then stitched on lace to the bottom of the leg hems using a zigzag stitch. The drawers came out slightly larger than I expected, so I added 2 little darts in the waistband near the centre back. With that, they were complete. So there's the drawers, a functional garment that came together fairly straightforwardly. The only issue was that waist turning out a bit big, but it had an easy fix. And I'm very pleased with my little decorative touches of the pin tucks and lace. So now let's move to the chemise. I followed the instructions by Elizabeth Stuart Clark and drafted out a pattern to fit me. I took the measurements required, including chemise length, neckline, sleeve length, and bicep. Then I drafted out my pattern shapes for the chemise body, sleeve, and neckband. I laid out my cotton voile on the fold, cut out a curved neckline for the back piece, and cut the sleeve shaping, then repeating that for the front piece, but this time with a straight neckline, in addition to the sleeve shaping. For the sleeves, I once again started with rectangles, then cut down to the drafted shapes. Here I foolishly did not properly account for the seam allowance at the sleeve hem. I attached the sleeves to the main body with a quick and easy overlock, then did the same to sew the side seams. With a long stitch length, I added 2 lines of gathering stitches around the neckline, then gathered the neckline into the neckband piece. To finish the essential sewing, I hemmed the sleeves and bottom edge. You can see how the sleeve is slightly puckered, but ah well, that will be kept in mind for future makes. As a final piece of decoration, I added more of the same lace as is on the drawers. And with that, the chemise was complete. It is a lightweight garment and sits as designed, and allows the pretty pin tucks and lace of the drawers to peek out. This was a very smooth and easy project. It took more time to press the fabric than to assemble it. The only issue with it is that I hadn't allowed enough room for the seam hem. The chemise is comfortable to wear and does exactly what I need it to do. I like how it sits just off the shoulders. When getting dressed, next come stockings and shoes. And these ones are from American Duchess. The silk stockings have beautiful black clocking on the sides. The shoes are Astoria in the colour ivory. I also have separate videos about how I fitted and then made my red-threaded 1860s Gored corset. I'm still very pleased with the corset, with its quilting, flossing, lace decoration, and overall shape. So once the corset is on, we can then also move on to the corset cover. The Christine corset cover by Bella Designs is a single size pattern, and so that meant I had to scale it up in order to fit me. It was a single size printed home pattern which I cut out and assembled. While wearing my underlayers done up loosely, I measured my overall bust circumference. Just the front, then just the back as a sense check. My total waist measurement, as well as the front and back. You won't be surprised that next came hips total, and then front and back. I also measured the length of the centre front, as well as top to waist and waist to bottom. Finally, I also measured the length of the front neckline, the back neckline, and the armscye. I compared my measurements to that of the pattern and found I needed to add 1.5 inches in length, to add 6 inches to the front panel to bring the bust large enough. I'll deal with the waist and hips later. And 1.5 inches to the back piece. I had never taped the vertical line for the back, so spread it out there. And slashed the front along the waistline to elongate that. I adjusted the pieces by adding in extra paper and then trimming down and smoothing as needed. I also added in the waist extension to the back piece. Then I slashed and spread the front piece. I rolled out a larger piece of paper, spread out the pieces of the front panel to my desired width, pinning along the bust line. I considered angling in to bring the hip size down to my measurements, but I didn't like the look of that, so I reverted to straight. I drew out the new outline of my pattern piece, smoothed down the edges, marked on the centre front, bust line and waistline. With that, my updated pattern pieces were ready. I marked my front pattern pieces onto cotton voile and cut out with ample spare fabric around the sides, bottom edge and strap length. Then I marked the back piece on the fold and similarly cut out with plenty of room, allowing me to do final fitting adjustments on my body. I decided to firstly lock in the centre front button band. I ironed the seam allowance back and then under. I turned on my machine and filled a bobbin. Then threaded the machine to sew. I top stitched the button band in place along the edge of the front pieces. On the back piece, I folded along the lines for the darts and pinned. Experimenting with potentially quick and easy approaches on this low-risk project, I pinned on the dart shape and basted along it, which led the back pieces to look like this. I pinned on a front piece at the side seam. Then I basted the side seam with a 4mm stitch length, and then did the same with the other side. Let's try on the corset cover. The back was sitting quite nicely. The first thing to adjust were the shoulder seams. I brought in the shoulders and was happy with how the neckline was sitting. Next step was to pin in darts under the bust. Once the darts were basted, I was pretty happy with the shape, but did want to bring the side seams an inch forward. Like so. With that, the adjustments on this loose protective garment were done. I decided to then overlock the seams to sew and finish them in single steps. I wove in any ends of overlocker thread that would not be later caught in edge binding. Then ironed the seams to the front, as is my preference. Just at the shoulders, I top stitched along the seam allowance to add strength and ensure it sits flat. At this stage, it was starting to look like a garment. I cut 1-inch wide strips of cotton voile on the bias, then stitched to the top edge of the corset cover. I folded the bias to the inside of the garment and ironed, then folded the raw edge under and ironed that as well, and then also secured the corners with a few pins and a press. To prepare to sew, I pinned all the way along. I used mode 2, stitch 17 on my Janome DM7200 as a decorative stitch to secure the top edge. Then I did the same on the arm side, and was amused by a pin standing upright in my magnetic pin tray. Back to the corset cover. The upper edges are finished. I tried it on again at this point and pinned at 5 places where I wanted to put the buttons, not equally spaced, but purposefully spaced. At the very top of the corset, mid-bust, under-bust and hip. I also marked the location of my arrow hook. We'll talk more about that soon. Finally, I marked the bottom edge line. Next, I selected 5 buttons, which were similar enough for a basic undergarment. I marked the starting point of the buttonholes and removed the pins. I used the machine to sew the buttonholes. Then with the 2 halves pinned together, I trimmed down the bottom edge. I gave it a press, and I folded it up by 2.5 centimeters and pressed that. I folded under the top edge and then snipped it and then folded under and pinned. Then I used the same stitch that I had used on the neckline to secure the hem, at which point the bottom of the corset cover looked like this. Now, back to that corset arrow hook. The roll is to keep down the bulk of the petticoat waistbands. I marked the place for the corset arrow hook to come through on the corset cover and cut out a rectangle of cotton voile to do a welt opening. I pinned the rectangle on, then stitched around where I wanted the opening to be, and cut along the middle. For a more detailed look at welted openings in the guise of pockets, please see my waistcoat video. I posted the welt fabric through the cut opening. And ironed flat. I top stitched around the opening, then trimmed down the fabric and folded under the raw edges, pinning in place. And back with stitch 17, as I had used on the edges, I sewed around the welt opening, and with that, the welt for the corset arrow hook was complete. So it's on, it's covering, so the chemise is the base layer. This is not a completely base layer, this is covering the corset. I'm pretty happy with how that's sitting, because particularly once you pull it in, it's sort of just in the right spot. It's like, winning! So yeah, it's providing a cover to the corset, which is its purpose. I marked with pins along the top edge of the corset, as well as a potential line of ruffles. I tore off 3-inch strips of cotton voile, then stitched a narrow hem along one side of each strip. I had enough lace for 4 ruffles. I stitched on the lace to the hemmed edge using a zigzag stitch. For the top edge, I rolled it down, then whipped around it, gathering it in. The whip-gathered ruffles then looked like this. I pinned them onto the corset cover and stitched them down. With that, the corset cover was complete. The corset cover came out well, adding a layer of protection over the corset, and those ruffles will help smooth the top line. I was also pleased with how the hole for the arrow hook came through. I was able to use that successfully, though you'll have to wait for later videos to see the details of the sewing of the hoop skirt and petticoats. Overall, I'm very happy with these 3 garments. Each of them are fairly quick projects, but together they all build towards the confection of 1860s undergarments. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this quick little video about these 3 frilly pieces of Victorian underwear. If you're so inclined, please feel free to like and subscribe, and I hope you'll join me again next time. Goodbye. Welcome to this video, which is all about how I made the truly Victorian elliptical cage crinoline. Particularly motivated because I wanted this shape of skirt for my modern fairy tale wedding gown. Floofy cupcake with more volume to the back than the front and able to support layers of petticoats and floaty tulle and lace. It's made with a bag of fabric at the bottom, into which the lower hoops sit. 4 bone channels of different sizes encircle the body, and the upper 4 wires just sit around the back, with ties to hold them in place. As more of the volume is in the rear, there's also a crescent of fabric off the back of the waistband, onto which many of the vertical support ribbons attach. Let's get to it. So the next thing I'm going to make is the elliptical hoop skirt. And to do that, I need to get the mannequin padded to my size so that I can do it. So this is the pattern that I'm intending to use for my wedding corset. And I think it's fitting pretty well. I probably want to wear it a little bit more around the house, just to be sure I'm happy with it. But I think I'm pretty good to go. The main point of today is to do some measurements so that when I'm mocking up Madam, padding up Madam to make the hoop skirt, that it's suitable. And really, I just need the waist for that. Right, I think that's all that I wanted to do today. Let's get Madam sorted. Okay, she's ready. So yes, there could be more padding at the hips. I could pad the bust more, but I don't need to, because I've got the general shape and I've got the waist to the point that I wanted. I also prepared my materials. I had striped cotton shirting fabric for the bottom bag of the hoop skirt, bone casing, herringbone tape for the waistband and the vertical support ribbons, as well as smaller cotton tape for the tie strings, heavy metal hoop wire, which I expect will not be enough, and so I also have lighter metal boning, which I use for corsetry, of which I have plenty. A gold buckle, metal bone caps, and finally I also have plumber's tape for binding the ends.
The bag is made up of pieces that are rectangular and close to rectangular, so I started by ripping fabric to the appropriate widths for the pieces I need. I decided to cut out what the pattern has as the front and side pieces of the bag as one, as I didn't see any reason to cut straight lines just to sew them up again. I cut the sides to the shape required. I also cut out the back pieces, which are shaped on both sides. From scraps, I cut out 4 crescent shapes. I laid one back piece onto one side piece and pinned in place. I stitched the seam together and overlocked to secure the raw edge. Then I stitched the seam down to one side to keep it flat. After attaching the other back and front side pieces, I laid the 2 halves over each other and then pinned the back seam, which was sewn in the same way. It was now all one long piece. I folded it in half lengthways and pinned the top edge together. Then I stitched along the top, leaving space at each end so that I can get into the front later to insert the bones. I pressed the seam open, then turned it right side out, and pressed flat. Next, it was time to join it into one big loop, so I pinned the front edge together. I stitched the seam, then top stitched to one side, so it sits nice and smoothly. At this point, it was in a big circle, and I was ready to sew the bone channels. I marked the front 8 inches to remind myself to keep that open for bone insertion. Then it was time for some long lines of stitches, creating the bone channels. I marked the distances I needed to sew from the edge on masking tape on my machine, which worked quite well. And while a little hard to see, at this point the bone casings were all sewn, and I had also marked on where the vertical ribbons need to attach. The bag was all prepared. As per the instructions, I cut my waistband from the herringbone tape with a good tail. The petticoats will sit under the arrow hook, but the hoop skirt waistband will sit at the waist. I threaded the waistband through the buckle at one end, folded under the raw end, and then stitched it to secure. And I overlocked the other end to bind it. We have a waistband on the waist of Madam. With all 4 layers of the crescent together, I stitched around the outer edge. I notched the seam, pressed it open over a ham, and then turned right sides out. After pressing, it was nice and flat, and then I top stitched around to lock it in place, and then added further layers of stitching. After it was all stitched, I overlocked the top edge to secure. Next, I marked the centre back of the waistband with a pin, I pinned on the crescent and stitched it to the waistband. Then I marked my ribbon placement as per the pattern. A quick try on to see how it felt, looking quite cute. And then I put the waistband back on to Madam. I cut each of the required vertical ribbons to length, plus a little extra for flexibility. And I marked all the locations of intersection with the bone channels, as directed in the pattern. I carefully labelled them as I methodically cut each ribbon. I attached the ribbons to the waistband, starting at the centre back and continuing out from there. Then I folded under the ends, pinned them in place, and stitched to secure, following along my previous lines of stitching, all nice and neat. For the front ribbons, I sewed the top into loops around the waistband so they can run freely along. And here we are so far. Starting with my heavy metal boning, which is indeed meant for hoops, I cut the desired lengths for the 4 metal hoops, hoop wires 9 to 12, to insert into the bottom bag. I trimmed the corners and applied the end cap, which is particularly tricky to film, and secured with plumber's tape, the same procedure as I do for metal corset bones. I then had my 4 longest hoop wires prepared, so it was time to insert into the bag. I secured the overlap of the bones with more plumber's tape so that they didn't move around or overlap more than I wanted and collapse in the bag. I kept on inserting the bones and securing with tape until all 4 bones were contained. At which point I could very awkwardly stitch the top of the bag closed. I attached the ribbons to the bag by pinning at the designated points. So far, all the weight is in the back. We shall see how it progresses. Next, it was time to cut bone casings, and I varied from the pattern just slightly, as instead of planning to overlap the hoop wire within the casing, I decided to overlap the casings and sew that into place. I marked the ribbon locations onto the casings as per the pattern. So here are the casings for hoop wires 5 to 8. I cut the bones to length. I had enough heavy metal boning for hoops 7 and 8, but I needed to use some of my lighter corset boning for hoops 5 and 6. I bound the ends, stitched one end of each casing to block it off. Then I inserted the bones and used quilting clips to overlap and keep them circular. Then I stitched them securely, although a little awkwardly, by machine. I added in the last couple of ribbons, pinning in place, and then clipped on hoops 8, 7, 6, and hoop 5, as per the placements that the pattern suggests. After letting the hoop skirt sit for a couple of days, and then taking another look at hoops 5 and 6, they just don't have the structural integrity that they need. They're not holding themselves out, so I don't think the corsetry boning is going to work. I tried to order some more heavy boning online, but it was out of stock, so my plan is to raid cheap old petticoats for hoops. I tried on a few options, and while this one has a pretty shape, it does drag along the ground, and so it's dirty and it has some damage, and so it was a good candidate for hoop donation. I removed the wobbly hoops 5 and 6. I harvested the hoop wires from the dirty and damaged petticoat. There was a little bit of breakage, so that got all wrapped up in plumber's tape. I replaced the hoop wire in hoops 5 and 6, and at this point I was back to where I thought I had been 9 days earlier, with each hoop round and supportive. Here we have hoops 1 to 4. 3 is the last of my original heavy boning, while the others are salvaged from petticoat hoop wire and patched up as needed. I cut casings and inserted the hoop wires. I also cut tie strings. Then I stitched a tie string to each end of the hoop wire casings, as these hoop wires do not go all the way around the body but end at the side front ribbon. I clipped hoop 4 into place, then hoop 3, hoop 2, and hoop 1, and pinning on the short side ribbons which start at hoop 1 rather than the crescent. Then I crawled under and tied all the ties to help develop the shape. At which point it looked like this. It was tipping to the front, not sitting level, and overall was not as smooth as I would like. I shortened the front ribbons, and that had some improvement straight away. I proceeded to do various small adjustments. trying to get the hoops level and the ribbons smooth. Then I carefully tried it on.
So here we are. I've got it on, and I think it's sitting on me pretty much as it was on Madam, so that's a good sign. And I'm ready to sew it. Overall, I'm happy that the hoops are all sitting fairly horizontally and that the ribbons are all flowing fairly well from top to bottom, not too wibbly wobbly, jerky worky. I know some people like to make a little bum pad to go under the crescent. So you can see the crescent on me, as it was on Madam, is attached at the waistband and then sticks out. It's not like that sitting flat against the body. I don't think it's meant to. And some people put an extra padded bum pad under there to provide support for that. And I think I might look at that down the track. But for the moment, I'm just going to start with it as is and see how much volume the petticoats add, because I don't want to add too much volume. So I think I'll take it step by step.
It was then time to hand sew each of the intersections of the hoop casings and vertical ribbons. To secure each point, I sew a few crosses to hold the ribbons and casings in place. This was a highly repetitive process, but with something on in the background, it went smoothly. At the end of a long day of hand stitching intersections, there was just hoop 1 and the side front ribbons left to do. The process of sewing at a side front intersection is a little different, as that's where the casings end, so you also have to be mindful of the ties. I stitched crosses along the hoop wire, using pliers as needed. I fold in the raw edge and add a final cross. To illustrate the changes I made, I put clips on where the pattern markings said to attach, noting that they do say to adjust before sewing, just as we have done. I added further pins to each ribbon on the bag to hold them straight while sewing. Stitching the ribbons to the bag was an awkward thing to do at this stage, but not locking in the exact placement until this point was something that was definitely worthwhile. And with that, the hoop skirt was complete. I am very happy with this truly Victorian TV103 1865 elliptical cage crinoline. It's comfortable to wear and easy to move in. It makes the perfect shape to support my petticoats, both when worn as 1860s undergarments, and it was just the shape that I wanted for my wedding day.
This video is all about how I made my 2 petticoats that go over my 1860s hoop skirt, which is what formed the structure of my wedding gown skirt. I will link the video about making my hoop skirt above and below. The base petticoat with 5 ruffles is to smooth out the hoop skirt ridges. The final petticoat is mainly smooth with just 1 ruffle along the bottom edge. The 2 petticoats have their openings on either sides of the body to spread the bulk. Both waistbands are flat at the front, sit smoothly and low down under the arrow hook, and move volume away from the waist. They both gather at the back for size adjustability, with the gathering ties on opposite sides. I started the creation process by drafting the waistbands. I lined up a piece of paper to the centre front, sketched on an initial idea of how the front should look, and played around with it until I had a waistband front pattern piece. I decided to make the base petticoat waistband 3 inches deep and the top petticoat 1.5 inches deep. I measured the back, both at the waist, 17 inches, and at the bottom of where the waistband would go, 22 inches. To allow room and gathering at the back, I decided to make the back of each waistband a rectangle 26 inches long, plus seam allowance and placket. I had 2 pieces of cotton voile folded to give 4 layers. I added seam allowance to my pattern and cut each on the fold, giving both the outer and the lining of the front waistband pieces for both petticoats. I also cut the rectangles for the back of the waistbands. I stitched the outer and lining front pieces of each waistband together along the top edge and down one side. I clipped the seam allowance and pressed open, then pressed right sides out. We can see the 2 waistbands with the closures planned for opposite sides, and the back rectangles have been pressed in half lengthways. I then marked seam allowance and placket placement, as well as the buttonhole locations for the gathering tapes. I added the buttonholes with 1 layer rolled out of the way. I do like the way that this machine can do buttonholes. A total of 4 buttonholes sewn, ready for the gathering tapes. With right sides together, I pinned the fronts to the backs for both the waistbands. I stitched those seams and also closed the other end of the back pieces. Now each waistband was a single piece, with the openings and buttonholes for the gatherings on opposite sides to spread the bulk. I inserted the gathering tapes and pinned them into place, 1 tape coming from each side of each waistband. I top stitched along the front of the waistband, secured the end of the tape, then carefully stitched the channel for the tape, allowing the tape to run free within the channel. Success! With that, both petticoat waistbands were prepared. And here is the wider waistband sitting on Madam, my dress form. The smooth front held down under the arrow hook and the back gathered in. My plan for the ruffled petticoat was for the base to sit fairly snugly to the cage, then ruffles over the top to smooth it all out. For the front panel, the centre front needs to be 63 centimetres. The side is 72 centimetres. The front is 7 centimetres lower than the side. The front width will be 45 centimetres, gathered into 30 centimetres. The bottom width should be 72 centimetres. For the back panels, the side is 72 centimetres long, and the back is 88 centimetres. The bottom edge needs to be 120 centimetres wide. At halfway up, it should be 80 centimetres wide. 3/4 of the way up should be 55 centimetres wide. So I'll cut the top to 55 centimetres plus seam allowance, which will gather in at the waistband. This gives more than the needed 88 centimetres of length along the angle for the centre back. I ripped off 3 pieces of cotton voile 80 centimetres deep. This will be my front piece, so I folded it in half, cut my side of the trapezoid, then cut down the waist for the front dip. Then I laid out the other 2 pieces of fabric together for the 2 back pieces and cut the angle into them. After sewing just the centre back seam, I laid the back piece on Madam, then the front piece, and I was happy to proceed. There was enough fabric to cover the hoop, but not vast amounts beyond that. I laid out the back and laid the front on top, pinning the side seam, which I then sewed. I then laid the other side seam together, pinning that and marking where the opening goes down to at the top. Next, I cut out a placket piece, which I folded over and overlocked at one end, then turned right side out and overlocked the long edge. I pressed the side seam of the petticoat open, pinned on the placket, then stitched and pressed, finishing by top stitching along both sides of the seam. With that, the base layer of the petticoat was all in one piece. The next step was to mark the front and back locations of where the ruffles will be attached. The ruffles will be spaced 20 centimetres apart along the centre back. I measured how long each ruffle needed to be. And I double-checked that the waistband had a total length less than the top of the petticoat base. Then I calculated how long each ruffle would need to be, with 2 times fullness to the gathering. I had a piece of cotton voile 6 meters long and 145 centimeters wide. I tore this into 5 even strips, each 29 centimeters wide. Then I pressed each strip, which did take a fair bit of time and effort. Huzzah! All 5 were smooth. I measured and cut off 4 meters for the upper ruffle. I used a rolled hem foot to hem the bottom edge of the ruffle. I find it best to really roll the edge in before feeding it into the machine, and to support the fabric as it goes in. I find this method gives a nice, neat edge. I also did the same on the short sides of the ruffle, as these will be open at the side of the petticoat. I put in 2 lines of gathering stitches into the top of the upper ruffle. And I also put 2 lines of gathering stitches along the top of the base layer of the petticoat. I gathered the ruffle and pinned it to the waistband, which I basted together. I then gathered the base layer of the petticoat and pinned that on too. I stitched the 3 layers together securely, and I overlocked the seam to keep it all neat. Then I folded under the waistband lining and pinned it down. I top stitched along the waistband to keep it all in place. With the top ruffle and waistband attached, I hung the petticoat on Madam to let the fabric relax and for any bias to stretch out. The upper ruffle was done. For the remainder of the ruffles, I decided to use the ruffle foot rather than gathering by hand, so I adjusted it so it had fairly minimal gathering. After hemming, as previously shown, I threaded the fabric into the foot, and then I just stitched, and the foot did all the work. The key is to keep the fabric feeding in straight. My first ruffle from the ruffle foot was only just long enough to make it around ruffle 2, which was fine. After that, I adjusted the stitch length to be less ruffled still. The looser gathering of the ruffle foot meant I had a bit under 2 times gathering, but that was still plenty of fullness. I had all 4 remaining ruffles ruffled. I marked the bottom edge of the petticoat along the top edge of the bag of the hoop skirt with a line of pins. I laid it out and averaged the pins from each side. Then I cut off the excess. I started to pin a long ruffle to the bottom edge of the petticoat. But I decided to switch to just holding the layers together once I was going and sewing them together with the overlocker. Once I was nearly back at the start, I snipped and tore off my excess, then overlocked the short edges of the ruffle together. Then finished attaching the ruffle to the bottom of the petticoat. Like so. I laid out the petticoat and marked the locations for the 3 remaining ruffles, first with pins, then with pencil. I turned it over and marked the other side as well, then removed the pins. I laid on ruffle 4 where I had marked it and put in a couple of pins at the start. Then I stitched on the ruffle with a simple top stitch. When I was back to near the start, I trimmed off the excess, I aligned the 2 short sides and overlocked them together. I pinned down the final section and stitched, finishing the ruffle. I did the same process with ruffle 3, at which point 4 of the 5 ruffles were on. Ruffle 2 begins and ends at the side opening, so next I needed to finish the first side edge with a rolled hem. After that, I top stitched the ruffle on and tore off at the required point once it was long enough. I rolled hemmed the final short edge and stitched the final portion of the ruffle to the petticoat. I stitched on 2 hook and bars to the waistband, and the ruffled petticoat was complete. For the smooth petticoat, I wanted just one big piece of fabric gathered into the waistband and one ruffle at the bottom. I overlocked the edges of my cotton voile and pinned them together, marking 30 centimeters from the top to leave open. I stitched the seam. I pressed the seam open, including the top opening. I prepared a second placket. I top stitched the seam allowance, which also stitched in the placket. I stitched 2 long lines of gathering stitches along the top. I gathered the top of the petticoat into the waistband, putting 150 centimeters into the front and the rest of the volume into the back. I stitched to secure the layers together. Then I overlocked that edge, then folded under the edge of the inside layer of the waistband, as I had done for the ruffled petticoat. Then I top stitched that in place. I added in the hooks and bars to this waistband, at which point it was looking like this. I marked 300mm off the floor. I averaged each half, and then I cut off the excess. From the scrap, I tore it off so that I had one long, even rectangle. Then I tore it in half to create two 22cm wide strips. I hemmed the bottom edge of each strip, then gathered the top edge with the ruffle foot. At this point, I had two ruffles, so I joined them together and used the overlocker to sew the ruffle onto the bottom of the smooth petticoat. For the wedding, I also added a small train section to the back of the smooth petticoat, but I'll discuss that further in my wedding skirt video. I am very happy with how these two petticoats came out, so floofy and delightful, creating a smooth base for my wedding skirts. And simultaneously being now ready for any future 1860s outfits. My 1860s undergarments were all complete.
The first garment I put on was my split drawers. I made these using the truly Victorian pattern TV 106, and I added pin tucks and lace to the bottom of the legs. Then I donned my 1860s chemise, which I drafted using the instructions from Elizabeth Stuart Clark. It sits off the shoulders, and I decorated it with matching lace along the hem. Next, I put on stockings and shoes from American Duchess. The silk stockings have beautiful black clocking on the sides. The shoes are Astoria in the colour ivory. Then it was time for my red-threaded 1860s Gored corset. This does take some care to put on and is comfortable and supportive. I made this corset out of Catile and red silk. I quilted the panels for the hip and bust gauze. I decorated it with lace and flossing using silk thread, and added an arrow hook to keep the waistband of my petticoats down. I'm really happy with the shape that it gives. To make my corset cover, I scaled up the Christine corset cover pattern from Bella May's Designs. I created an opening for the arrow hook, and I added lace-trimmed ruffles to smooth the hard line from the upper edge of the corset. I made the truly Victorian 1865 Elliptical Cage Crinoline, TV 103. This was a nice pattern to work with. The bag at the bottom means I don't step through the hoops, and I really like how the volume is to the rear. It's easy to sit down in and to manoeuvre. I made a ruffled petticoat out of cotton voile. The waistband is held down at the front under the arrow hook on the corset. 5 tiers of ruffles give lots of body and smooth out over the hoops. My final 1860s undergarment is a simpler petticoat, this time with a narrower waistband and just 1 ruffle at the hem. Overall, the undergarments are delightful, particularly when twirling.